Echoes of Stone and Steel. The Making of New York's Skyline. Part 1. Prologue. The City That Touches the Clouds. The morning sun rises over Manhattan like a slow exhale of light. Steel and glass shimmer in hues of gold and silver, reflecting a city that seems to breathe in rhythm with the sky itself. From the Hudson to the East River, towers stand like monuments to ambition, whispering stories of centuries past, stories written not on paper, but in stone, brick, and iron. The skyline of New York City is more than an outline against the heavens. It is a chronicle, a timeline etched vertically instead of horizontally. Each building is a chapter, each shadow a memory, each reflection a dream once dared by men and women who refused to accept the horizon as a limit. Today, tourists crane their necks toward One World Trade Center, the Empire State Building, or the Art Deco crown of the Chrysler Building. They take photos, gaze upward, and marvel at the immensity. But few pause to ask, how did this happen? How did a swampy island, once dotted with wooden houses and muddy streets, become the architectural heart of the modern world? The answer lies buried beneath centuries, in the soil of ambition, the dust of demolition, and the echo of every hammer that struck the stone before steel came to rule the sky. A city built on hunger. New York was never meant to be ordinary. From its earliest days, when it was little more than a Dutch trading post called Nieuw Amsterdam, it carried the pulse of something larger, a hunger for growth, for commerce, for life itself. The harbor, deep and wide, invited ships from every corner of the world. Traders came for furs, colonists came for freedom, and dreamers came for a new beginning. The land was wild, uneven, and brimming with possibility. In those days there were no towers, only timber and brick, built low and wide, huddled against the harsh Atlantic winds. The skyline was horizontal, a patchwork of chimneys, gables, and church spires. Yet even then, the seed of verticality had been planted. For the people who came here, life was a climb, upward, forward, beyond. It was only a matter of time before their buildings began to mirror their ambition. Whispers of Stone. By the early 19th century, New York was transforming. The city expanded northward from its colonial tip like a rising tide. Streets were cut, grids were drawn, and the island began to take the shape we know today. Stone replaced wood, brownstone, limestone, and marble, each telling a different story of wealth, taste, and aspiration. The brownstone row houses of Brooklyn and Manhattan became the city's architectural signature. They were sturdy, elegant, and human-scaled, a reflection of a growing middle class who sought permanence in a city defined by motion. They stood shoulder to shoulder, as if protecting one another from the chaos of the streets. Behind those facades, families dreamed of stability, immigrants built new lives, and society found its rhythm. But beneath the calm beauty of those brownstones, something was shifting. Technology was changing. Iron was replacing timber. Elevators were whispering possibilities. And deep beneath the streets, engineers began to imagine, what if we built not out, but up? The arrival of steel. It began as an industrial revolution, but in New York it became a spiritual one. Steel, that shimmering miracle of modernity, changed everything. It was lighter than stone, stronger than wood, and limitless in its potential. Suddenly, the city could rise like never before. The first steel frame buildings appeared in the late 1800s. They weren't beautiful at first, more machine than masterpiece, but they were alive with promise. Architects began to compete not only for beauty, but for height. Newspapers printed headlines like, "Who will build the next tower?" The skyline became a battlefield of innovation, and every block a frontier. Among the chaos, visionaries emerged, men like William LeBaron Jenney, Cass Gilbert, and William Van Allen, each with their own vision of how high human hands could reach. Their tools were blueprints, their weapons were beams and rivets, and their victories were measured in floors, not feet. The city as a mirror. By the dawn of the 20th century, New York had become a paradox, old and new, humble and grand, crumbling and rising all at once. The skyline was no longer just a silhouette, it was a statement. The Woolworth Building, once called the Cathedral of Commerce, stood as proof that business could be as sacred as any religion. Its Gothic spires reached for the heavens, carved not by monks, but by masons of steel. The skyline reflected America's evolving identity. Each decade brought a new chapter, the optimism of the Roaring Twenties, the despair of the Depression, the resilience of post-war renewal. Buildings rose, fell, and rose again, like the city itself, unbreakable and endlessly reborn. The heartbeat of a skyline. To walk through Manhattan is to walk through time. The cast-iron facades of Soho whisper the dreams of the 19th century. The glass towers of Midtown hum with the energy of the 21st century. And in between, in the shadows and reflections, lives the heartbeat of New York. Restless, relentless, radiant. The skyline has always been more than architecture. It is emotion made visible. It tells us who we were, who we are, and who we're trying to be. Every generation adds its voice, a new building, a new style, a new dream to the chorus of stone and steel that defines the city. Echoes. At night, from across the river, the city glows, a constellation of human triumph. Every window, every light, every shadow tells a story. Some of those stories began centuries ago, when the island was still half forest and half hope. Some began only yesterday, in the glimmer of a crane's arm or the reflection of a passing cloud. But together they formed the same echo, the echo of ambition, of progress, of resilience, the echo of stone and steel, the echo of New York.
The Colonial Bones, from Nieuw Amsterdam to New York. Before steel, before glass, before ambition even found its shape, there was a wilderness. In the early 1600s, the island that would one day become Manhattan was an untouched landscape, rocky, forested, edged with marshland and rivers that glimmered in the morning mist. The Lenape people fished in its streams and hunted in its woods, long before the first Dutch ship sailed into its harbor. When those ships arrived in 1624, they brought more than cargo. They brought an idea, the idea of settlement, trade, and permanence. The Dutch called it Nieuw Amsterdam, and though it began as a mere trading outpost for the Dutch West India Company, it quickly became something more, a seed of civilization in a new and untamed world. The first buildings were crude, timber structures with thatched roofs, built for survival rather than style. Yet even in those humble beginnings, the city's architectural DNA began to form, practical, adaptive, and always driven by purpose. A city of merchants and forts. Nieuw Amsterdam's first structures served trade and defense. A wooden fort, later called Fort Amsterdam, stood near the southern tip of the island. Around it grew warehouses, inns, and small homes, all clustered within walls meant to keep out the wild. The streets were narrow, irregular, winding not by plan, but by necessity. And yet this chaos, held the beginnings of character. The city that would one day define order by its grid started in disorder, a tangle of ambition and improvisation. The Dutch brought with them their architectural sensibilities: brick facades, stepped gables, tall, narrow windows, and stoops that lifted homes above the muddy streets. These houses looked out of place in the New World, European elegance set against raw American soil, but they gave the settlement identity. It was not beauty that Nieuw Amsterdam sought, it was endurance. When empires changed hands. In 1664, a shift of power changed everything. English warships sailed into the harbor, and the Dutch, vastly outnumbered, surrendered without a fight. Nieuw Amsterdam became New York, named for the Duke of York, and with that name came a new destiny. The English left much of the Dutch character intact, but layered upon it their own sense of order. Streets were renamed. The fort became a governor's residence. Brick replaced timber, and Anglican churches began to rise where Dutch Reformed ones had stood. The architecture of the young city was now a fusion, Dutch practicality mixed with English formality. Small houses lined the crooked lanes of the lower city. Gardens bloomed in narrow plots, and at the heart of it all stood churches and taverns, symbols of faith and commerce, the twin pillars of early New York life. Still, it was not grandeur that defined the colony. It was survival, a constant adaptation to fire, flood, and growth. And yet with each rebuild, the city's boons grew stronger. The fires that forged. New York burned many times. The fires of 1711, 1741, and later decades tore through wooden homes and shops, consuming blocks at a time. Each disaster left the city wounded, but wiser. Brick and stone began to replace wood as the preferred materials, not for beauty, but for safety. These decisions, born from catastrophe, shaped the character of the city forever. New York learned to rebuild, not as it was, but as it should have been. The Trinity Church, first erected in 1698, rose as a beacon of permanence after fire and storms. Its spire, though modest by today's standards, was a towering landmark for ships entering the harbor. It symbolized the city's resilience, faith expressed through architecture. In these years, New York began to develop something deeper than buildings. It developed identity, one built on endurance, adaptation, and ambition disguised as necessity. A colonial mosaic. By the mid-18th century, New York was no longer a rough outpost. It was a thriving colonial city, second only to Philadelphia in size and influence. The streets were alive in languages. Dutch, English, German, and African tongues mingled in the air. Slaves, artisans, merchants, and soldiers coexisted uneasily, each contributing to the pulse of the city. The architecture reflected this mix. Dutch houses stood beside English town homes. Churches of every denomination dotted the skyline, if one could call it that. The tallest structures were still steeples, not towers. The city stretched outward, not upward, spreading its roots rather than lifting its head. But change was coming, and it would come not through architects, but through revolution. The revolutionary city. When the American Revolution broke out in 1775, New York became a stage for war. British forces occupied the city for much of the conflict, leaving behind both scars and infrastructure. Fires once again consumed neighborhoods, including much of the lower city in 1776. When the war ended, the young United States found its largest city in ruins, but alive. Rebuilding again became an act of rebirth. The new republic demanded a new identity, and New York was ready to provide it. Brick became the language of progress. Georgian and federal-style buildings emerged, inspired by classical ideals of balance and order. The Federal Hall, rebuilt in 1789, became a symbol of national dignity, the place where George Washington took the oath of office as the first president of the United States. From the ashes of empire, a city of democracy began to rise. The grid and the dream. In 1811, something remarkable happened, something that would forever define New York's shape. The city commissioners introduced the Commissioner's Plan, a grid system that mapped the island into a logical, organized pattern of streets and avenues. To some, it was soulless geometry. To others, it was genius, the architecture of opportunity. It imposed order on chaos, turning nature into possibility. Every block became a blank canvas, every intersection a future neighborhood. It was a design that anticipated growth not just of buildings, but of people, millions yet to come. This grid would become the invisible skeleton beneath the skyline, the colonial bones upon which the modern city would grow. And though the buildings of that era have long since vanished, their spirit remains in every corner of Manhattan. A city reborn, ready to rise. As the 19th century began, the New York that had once been a colonial settlement now stood as a bustling port, a capital of commerce, and a symbol of the new American dream. Immigrants arrived in waves, ships filled the harbor, the sound of hammers and wheels filled the air. No longer was the city a mirror of Europe, it was something new, something untamed, an American city defined not by its past, but by its future. The skyline was still low, but the ambition was towering. And soon, with the coming of iron, steam, and steel, that ambition would find form. Because this city, this restless, roaring city, had learned one lesson above all others. If it falls, it rises again. And every time, it rises higher.
Stone and Ambition, the rise of the brownstone era. The dawn of the 19th century found New York restless once again. The revolution was over, but another kind of war had begun, not of muskets and empires, but of ambition and survival. The young republic was forging its identity, and nowhere did that identity burn brighter than on the streets of Manhattan. The old colonial buildings still stood, but they looked tired, relics of a world too small for the dreams that now filled the island. Ships from every corner of the earth crowded the harbor. Merchants grew rich, immigrants poured in, and the city began to pulse with a new rhythm, the rhythm of progress. And progress in New York was always measured in construction. A city in motion. By the 1820s, Manhattan was expanding northward, spilling beyond its old Dutch core. The narrow, winding lanes of Lower Manhattan gave way to the logic of the 1811 grid plan, streets marching in straight lines toward an imagined future. Real estate speculators, architects, and masons followed the grid like miners chasing a vein of gold. Each new block offered the promise of wealth, respectability, and permanence. Yet permanence required material, and wood, the old colonial standby, could no longer suffice.
The fires that had devastated New York time and again had taught a hard lesson. Only stone could stand against the city's relentless hunger. That stone would define an era, and its color was brown. The birth of the brownstone. Brownstone, a warm reddish sandstone quarried from places like Portland, Connecticut, became the face of New York's 19th century. It was durable yet workable, affordable yet elegant, and above all, abundant. By the 1840s, entire neighborhoods were rising in brownstone. Builders developed standardized facades, 3 to 5 stories, high stoops, tall windows, iron railings, and graceful cornices. The New York brownstone became both a practical solution and a cultural aspiration, a home for the city's emerging middle class. From Greenwich Village to Harlem, from Brooklyn Heights to Park Slope, rows of identical facades lined the streets like soldiers in formation, each whispering the same quiet promise: here you belong, here you have made it. For immigrants and merchants alike, owning a brownstone was more than property. It was validation, proof that in this land of chaos and commerce, one could carve out stability. The architecture of aspiration. The brownstone house was not just architecture, it was narrative. Its stoop symbolized ascent, a literal rise above the street, away from the noise, filth, and uncertainty below. Inside, high ceilings and decorative moldings reflected dignity. Bay windows invited light into lives that had known darkness. And though most brownstones shared a similar look, no two were entirely the same. Owners added flourishes, ornate ironwork, carved faces, small balconies, subtle expressions of individuality within conformity. It was a democracy of design, accessible, repeatable, yet deeply personal. For the first time, architecture in New York wasn't only for the wealthy, it was for the striving. It was the architecture of the American dream. Immigrants and industry. Behind those brownstone facades, entire worlds coexisted. Irish dockworkers, German craftsmen, Italian masons, and Jewish tailors all played a role in shaping the neighborhoods that defined the city's growing identity. The Industrial Revolution transformed more than factories. It transformed the city's skyline at the human scale. Cast iron facades appeared in Soho, enabling larger windows and cheaper construction. Gas lighting and indoor plumbing began to turn the brownstone into a symbol of modern comfort. And as the working class found pride in labor, the middle class found pride in architecture. The home itself became a declaration, not of wealth, but of arrival. A city of contrasts. But not all of New York shared in the prosperity. Just blocks away from the elegant brownstone rows, poverty festered in overcrowded tenements. Immigrants who could not afford the promise of stone found themselves crammed into airless rooms where disease and despair spread faster than opportunity. This contrast, opulence beside struggle, became the city's most defining paradox. New York was both dream and nightmare, progress and peril. And yet, even in the shadows of hardship, the city's architecture continued to evolve. Reformers and architects began to speak of light, air, and dignity as rights, not luxuries. These ideas would one day shape the great housing movements of the 20th century, but their roots were here, in the uneven streets of the 19th. The rise of the architect. Until now, most of New York's builders had been craftsmen, men of tools rather than vision. But as the century matured, a new figure emerged, the architect as artist. Men like Alexander Jackson Davis, Richard Upjohn, and Calvert Vos began to reimagine what American architecture could be. They drew from European styles, Gothic, Italianate, Romanesque, and reshaped them for an American audience. Upjohn's Trinity Church, completed in 1846, stood at Broadway and Wall Street like a stone sermon on faith and craftsmanship. Its soaring spire became a moral compass amid the chaos of commerce. And while Voss and Olmsted envisioned something revolutionary, a city that needed not only buildings, but breathing space, their creation, Central Park, would become the green heart of Manhattan, an architectural achievement made not of stone or steel, but of landscape and philosophy. The city was learning that architecture could inspire as much as shelter. Fire, fear, and iron. As the city grew, so did its appetite for space, for power, for height. The brownstone streets began to choke under the weight of progress. The very material that had defined an era now limited it. Brownstone, though beautiful, could not reach beyond a few stories. Iron, however, could. In the 1850s, cast iron emerged as the next great frontier. Entire facades in neighborhoods like Soho were molded rather than carved. Mass-produced elegance at industrial speed. These buildings, with their Corinthian columns and grand arched windows, were temples of commerce, the first whispers of the skyscraper age to come. But before the city could rise vertically, it would fall once more into chaos. War was coming, not a colonial skirmish, but a national reckoning. The Civil War changed New York profoundly. Though the fighting never reached its streets, the city became a cauldron of conflict, politically divided, racially strained, and economically vital. Factories churned out materials for the Union Army. Fortunes were made in contracts and shipping, but riots, protests, and fire reminded the city how fragile its progress was. Yet even through unrest, the building never stopped. In 1868, the first sections of the Brooklyn Bridge were planned, a vision so vast it bordered on madness. Architect John A. Roebling and his son Washington Roebling would take nearly 2 decades to complete it, but when finished, it would stand as a bridge not of stone and wire, but of faith in human ingenuity. The bridge would mark the end of the brownstone era and the beginning of something new, something higher, lighter, faster. The skyline was about to awaken. The last of the stone era. By the 1880s, brownstone's dominance began to fade. Steel was on the horizon, and architects were dreaming in height.
It began with a single innovation, the steel frame. For centuries, buildings had relied on thick masonry walls to carry their weight. But steel changed the rules. Steel was strong, flexible, and light. It could bear immense loads without bulk. And with the invention of the elevator, height was no longer a burden, it was a possibility. The age of the skyscraper had begun, and nowhere would that age find a louder, prouder voice than in New York City. The birth of the vertical city. The first wave of steel frame buildings rose cautiously, like newborn giants testing their limbs. Structures such as the Tower Building, 1889, and Gillender Building, 1897, were marvels of engineering, though modest by modern standards. But they revealed a truth that would define the century. In New York, success wasn't about space, it was about height. The city's land was finite, its population exploding. The only way forward was upward. Developers and architects entered a new kind of race, not for land, but for the sky. Each decade brought taller, bolder silhouettes. The skyline, once a jagged collection of church steeples, now sprouted towers of steel and glass, glittering with electric light. By 1900, Manhattan was a forest of ambition. Cathedrals of commerce. If churches had once been the tallest buildings in the city, now business took their place. The skyscraper became the Cathedral of Commerce, a symbol of faith not in God, but in progress, money, and human ingenuity. The Flatiron Building, completed in 1902, captured the imagination of the world. Its unique triangular shape, like a prow cutting through a sea of traffic, made it an instant icon. People stood in awe of it, unsure whether it was art or madness. But to New Yorkers, it was both. It was proof that their city could turn imagination into iron. Soon after, the Singer Building and the Metropolitan Life Tower competed for the title of tallest in the world. Each one pushed boundaries, daring gravity to resist. Each one was a declaration, we can build higher still. The Roaring Twenties, the skyline awakens. By the 1920s, New York had become the stage for an architectural arms race. The economy was booming, jazz filled the night, and architects, armed with steel and dreams, were ready to redefine beauty. This was the age of Art Deco, and its spirit fit New York perfectly, glamorous, confident, and unapologetically modern. Buildings no longer hid their structure, they celebrated it. Geometry became decoration, light became art. The Chrysler Building, completed in 1930, was the ultimate expression of this era, a symphony of metal and motion. Designed by William Van Allen, it rose 1,046 feet with a crown that shimmered like a sunrise in chrome. For a brief, shining moment, it was the tallest building in the world. Its rival, the Empire State Building, would soon surpass it, but the Chrysler remained beloved, a monument to elegance and audacity. In those years, New York learned not only to build high, but to build beautifully. The Empire State, ambition without limit. The Great Depression had begun. Across America, banks were failing, and despair hung heavy in the air. But in New York, construction cranes still pierced the clouds. The Empire State Building rose from the ground in just 13 months, a feat so impossible that it bordered on myth. 3,400 workers, many of them immigrants and Mohawk ironworkers, risked their lives on the open beams. They ate lunch sitting hundreds of feet above the streets, the wind roaring past their boots. When the building opened, it stood as the tallest structure on Earth, 1,250 feet of hope in an age of hardship. New Yorkers looked up and saw more than steel. They saw proof that even in darkness, the city would rise. That's what New York does. It builds its way out of despair. Skyscrapers and souls. The skyscraper was more than engineering. It was psychology, an expression of the human need to conquer limits. Every floor, every rivet, every pane of glass represented courage and faith in the future. But with height came new challenges. Wind, gravity, and cost tested architects in ways no blueprint could predict. Elevator systems had to evolve. Foundations had to be reimagined. And through trial, tragedy, and triumph, the Skyline became a laboratory for human genius. The men who built these towers, steelworkers, architects, financiers, may have stood on different levels of society, but they shared the same vision: to touch the sky, no matter the cost. The Depression years, the sky stands still. When the Great Depression deepened, construction ground to a halt. Many skyscrapers stood half empty, their lights darkened by economic despair. But even in those quiet years, the skyline remained a symbol of endurance. Tourists visited the Empire State Building not for offices, but for wonder. Photographers captured its silhouette against storm clouds and sunsets, turning architecture into mythology. New York learned that its skyline was not just physical, it was emotional, a monument to resilience in a city that refused to bow. Bridges to the future. While skyscrapers reached upward, bridges reached outward. The Brooklyn Bridge, completed in 1883, had paved the way, but its successors, the Williamsburg, Manhattan, and George Washington bridges, transformed the city into a single connected organism. Each bridge was a poem written in cables and stone. They bound boroughs, united people, and expanded the city's possibilities. Without them, the skyline would have only been half a story. With them, New York became whole. A new age dawned. By the late 1930s, New York's skyline had taken on its recognizable form. The Chrysler, the Empire State, the Woolworth, the Rockefeller Center, each a masterpiece of its time, each a reflection of the era's soul. But even as they stood triumphant, whispers of change began to stir. Glass was coming. Modernism was coming. The next generation of architects would reject ornament, strip away detail, and chase purity of form. The age of Art Deco's splendor would fade, giving way to a new language, one of transparency, efficiency, and corporate power. Still, the echo of the Steel Revolution never left, because once New York learned to touch the sky, it would never stop reaching.
The war years. When the United States entered World War II in 1941, New York transformed almost overnight. Factories that had once built elevators, steel frames, and decorative facades now produced artillery shells, aircraft engines, and military supplies. Workers, many of them women for the first time in heavy industry, labored long hours, the roar of machinery echoing like a second heartbeat beneath the skyline. Construction slowed, but it did not stop entirely. Temporary structures, warehouses, and utilitarian office buildings sprang up to support the war effort. The city's architects and engineers adapted to scarcity, working with rationed steel, concrete, and glass. Yet even amid rationing, the skyline remained defiant. Its towers were monuments not only to ambition, but to resilience. They were a reminder that even in the darkest times, New York would endure. The shadows of the Depression. The scars of the Great Depression were still visible. Many of the towers built in the Roaring '20s had remained half-empty for years, their tenants unable to pay rent. Banks foreclosed, businesses shuttered, and neighborhoods struggled. But New Yorkers were nothing if not persistent. The city rebuilt in spirit even when money was scarce. Architects began experimenting with design efficiencies. Engineers devised lighter structures, and public works projects funded by federal initiatives like the Works Progress Administration put thousands to work. Art Deco, once the language of exuberance, gave way to restrained classicism. Ornamentation became minimal. The skyline may have slowed, but it never stopped. And behind every unfinished building and empty office was the echo of ambition, waiting for the moment it could rise again. Post-war optimism. With the war's end in 1945 came a wave of optimism. The skyline, long paused by conflict, surged forward with renewed energy. Corporate headquarters, hotels, and residential towers began to climb, fueled by post-war prosperity. One of the era's first symbols was the United Nations headquarters, completed in 1952 along the East River. Its sleek glass and steel design signaled a new architectural philosophy: transparency, globalism, and modernity. The UN was more than a building, it was a statement. New York was no longer just an American city, it was the capital of a new world order. The Modernist Revolution. By the 1950s and 1960s, New York had embraced modernism fully. Steel and glass replaced stone. Minimalism replaced ornamentation. The skyline became a composition of rectangles, reflecting the sky and the ambitions of corporations rather than centuries of classical artistry. Architects like Ludwig Mies van der Rohe and firms like Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill reshaped Manhattan with rational, functional designs. Towers became taller, lighter, and uniform. The city was now a laboratory in vertical geometry, an experiment in space, light, and power. Yet even as modernism dominated, echoes of the past remained. Brownstones, Gothic spires, and Art Deco crowns whispered their stories, reminding the city that progress does not erase history, it builds upon it. Bridges, highways, and urban expansion. The post-war period was also a time of outward growth. New highways, tunnels, and bridges connected Manhattan to the suburbs and the outer boroughs. The George Washington Bridge and expanded Brooklyn-Queens Expressway facilitated the daily migration of workers and commerce. Architecture no longer existed only in the downtown core. It now spanned the boroughs, integrating neighborhoods into a citywide network. New towers rose in Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx, symbols that New York's ambitions were no longer confined to Manhattan alone. Challenges and controversy. Despite the optimism, not every project was embraced. Urban renewal initiatives in the 1950s and 1960s, while transformative, often displaced communities. Entire neighborhoods were razed for expressways and high-rises. Public debate over preservation versus progress became a defining conversation, one that continues today. Yet the skyline remained resilient. Every demolished building paved the way for a new vision. Every crane, every blueprint, every structural beam echoed the same message. New York does not stop building, it reinvents itself. The symbolism of resilience. Through wars, economic depression, and social upheaval, New York's skyline remained a visual testament to resilience. Its towers were more than offices, hotels, and apartments. They were markers of human spirit, of a city that refuses to bend. Even small details, a cornice here, a spire there, told the story of survival overcome, of ambition deferred but never denied. By the 1960s, the skyline had become both functional and symbolic. A city that had learned to endure, innovate, and rise again and again. A prelude to the Glass Age. As Part 5 closes, New York stands on the cusp of transformation. The post-war era had set the stage for an architectural revolution yet to come. The glass towers, global corporate power, and minimalist modernism. The steel giants of the early 20th century had taught the city to climb. The Depression, war, and post-war expansion taught it to adapt. And now the skyline was ready for its next chapter, a chapter of light, transparency, and ambition that would make New York recognizable not just in America, but across the world. The Colonial Bones, from New Amsterdam to New York. Before steel, before glass, before ambition even found its shape, there was a wilderness. In the early 1600s, the island that would one day become Manhattan was an untouched landscape, rocky, forested, edged with marshland and rivers that glimmered in the morning mist. The Lenape people fished in its streams and hunted in its woods, long before the first Dutch ship sailed into its harbor. When those ships arrived in 1624, they brought more than cargo. They brought an idea, the idea of settlement, trade, and permanence. The Dutch called it Nieuw Amsterdam, and though it began as a mere trading outpost for the Dutch West India Company, it quickly became something more, a seed of civilization in a new and untamed world. The first buildings were crude, timber structures with thatched roofs, built for survival rather than style. Yet even in those humble beginnings, the city's architectural DNA began to form, practical, adaptive, and always driven by purpose. A city of merchants and forts. Nieuw Amsterdam's first structures served trade and defense. A wooden fort, later called Fort Amsterdam, stood near the southern tip of the island. Around it grew warehouses, inns, and small homes, all clustered within walls meant to keep out the wild. The streets were narrow, irregular, winding not by plan, but by necessity. And yet this chaos held the beginnings of character. The city that would one day define order by its grid started in disorder, a tangle of ambition and improvisation. The Dutch brought with them their architectural sensibilities, brick facades, stepped gables, tall, narrow windows, and stoops that lifted homes above the muddy streets. These houses looked out of place in the New World, European elegance set against raw American soil, but they gave the settlement identity. It was not beauty that Nieuw Amsterdam sought, it was endurance. When empires changed hands. In 1664, a shift of power changed everything. English warships sailed into the harbor, and the Dutch, vastly outnumbered, surrendered without a fight. Nieuw Amsterdam became New York, named for the Duke of York, and with that name came a new destiny. The English left much of the Dutch character intact, but layered upon it their own sense of order. Streets were renamed. The fort became a governor's residence. Brick replaced timber, and Anglican churches began to rise where Dutch Reformed ones had stood. The architecture of the young city was now a fusion, Dutch practicality mixed with English formality. Small houses lined the crooked lanes of the lower city. Gardens bloomed in narrow plots, and at the heart of it all stood churches and taverns, symbols of faith and commerce, the twin pillars of early New York life. Still, it was not grandeur that defined the colony. It was survival, a constant adaptation to fire, flood, and growth. And yet with each rebuild, the city's bones grew stronger. The fires that forged. New York burned many times. The fires of 1711, 1741, and later decades tore through wooden homes and shops, consuming blocks at a time. Each disaster left the city wounded, but wiser. Brick and stone began to replace wood as the preferred materials, not for beauty, but for safety. These decisions, born from catastrophe, shaped the character of the city forever. New York learned to rebuild, not as it was, but as it should have been. The Trinity Church, first erected in 1698, rose as a beacon of permanence after fire and storms. Its spire, though modest by today's standards, was a towering landmark for ships entering the harbor. It symbolized the city's resilience, faith expressed through architecture. In these years, New York began to develop something deeper than buildings. It developed identity, one built on endurance, adaptation, and ambition disguised as necessity. A colonial mosaic. By the mid-18th century, New York was no longer a rough outpost. It was a thriving colonial city, second only to Philadelphia in size and influence. The streets were alive in languages. Dutch, English, German, and African tongues mingled in the air. Slaves, artisans, merchants, and soldiers coexisted uneasily, each contributing to the pulse of the city. The architecture reflected this mix. Dutch houses stood beside English town homes. Churches of every denomination dotted the skyline, if one could call it that. The tallest structures were still steeples, not towers. The city stretched outward, not upward, spreading its roots rather than lifting its head. But change was coming, and it would come not through architects, but through revolution. The revolutionary city. When the American Revolution broke out in 1775, New York became a stage for war. British forces occupied the city for much of the conflict, leaving behind both scars and infrastructure. Fires once again consumed neighborhoods, including much of the lower city in 1776. When the war ended, the young United States found its largest city in ruins, but alive. Rebuilding again became an act of rebirth. The new republic demanded a new identity, and New York was ready to provide it. Brick became the language of progress. Georgian and federal-style buildings emerged, inspired by classical ideals of balance and order. The Federal Hall, rebuilt in 1789, became a symbol of national dignity, the place where George Washington took the oath of office as the first president of the United States. From the ashes of empire, a city of democracy began to rise. The grid and the dream. In 1811, something remarkable happened, something that would forever define New York's shape. The city commissioners introduced the Commissioner's Plan, a grid system that mapped the island into a logical, organized pattern of streets and avenues. To some, it was soulless geometry. To others, it was genius, the architecture of opportunity. It imposed order on chaos, turning nature into possibility. Every block became a blank canvas, every intersection a future neighborhood. It was a design that anticipated growth not just of buildings, but of people, millions yet to come. This grid would become the invisible skeleton beneath the skyline, the colonial bones upon which the modern city would grow. And though the buildings of that era have long since vanished, their spirit remains in every corner of Manhattan. A city reborn, ready to rise. As the 19th century began, the New York that had once been a colonial settlement now stood as a bustling port, a capital of commerce, and a symbol of the new American dream. Immigrants arrived in waves, ships filled the harbor, the sound of hammers and wheels filled the air. No longer was the city a mirror of Europe, it was something new, something untamed, an American city defined not by its past, but by its future. The skyline was still low, but the ambition was towering. And soon, with the coming of iron, steam, and steel, that ambition would find form. Because this city, this restless, roaring city, had learned one lesson above all others. If it falls, it rises again. And every time, it rises higher.
Echoes and preservation. Balancing heritage and progress in the 21st century.
The skyline of New York City in the 21st century is a living tapestry. Every tower, spire, and bridge tells a story. Some hundreds of years old, some just decades. The city has grown upward and outward, but it has also looked inward, reflecting on its heritage even as it reaches for new heights. Modern skyscrapers now coexist with brownstones, Art Deco masterpieces, and historic bridges. The challenge is delicate: how to preserve the soul of the city while embracing the ambitions of the future. Remembering the past. Preservation movements gained momentum in the late 20th century. Landmark laws protected iconic neighborhoods and buildings, ensuring that Soho, the Flatiron District, and the Brooklyn brownstones remained intact. These efforts were not simply about nostalgia, they were about identity, about maintaining continuity between generations. Every preserved facade is a whisper from the past, a reminder that the city's greatness is built on centuries of human endeavor. The new giants. At the same time, the city could not ignore the pressures of growth. Population expansion, global business, and tourism demanded new towers, taller, more efficient, and increasingly sustainable. The 21st century introduced architectural icons such as One World Trade Center, 2014, rising from the ashes of tragedy, a symbol of resilience, hope, and renewal. 432 Park Avenue, 2015, redefining residential skyscrapers with sleek minimalism and unprecedented height. Hudson Yards, 2019, a new urban ecosystem blending residential, commercial, and public spaces with bold design. Each structure is more than a building. It is a statement of the city's evolving ambition. Sustainability and innovation. Modern architecture also faces new imperatives. Climate change, energy efficiency, and environmental responsibility have transformed the way towers are designed. Glass is no longer just reflective. It can insulate, filter light, and generate energy. Steel is lighter and more resilient, incorporating recycled materials. Urban planners integrate green spaces, pedestrian-friendly zones, and public transportation to ensure the skyline is livable, not just impressive. New York has learned that innovation must balance height with humanity. Cultural continuity. Despite technological leaps, the city retains its cultural heartbeat. Neighborhoods like Harlem, Greenwich Village, and Brooklyn Heights continue to reflect the diversity that built the city. Every street, plaza, and skyline silhouette tells the story of immigrants, workers, artists, and visionaries who made New York what it is today. Even the newest skyscrapers are grounded in this continuum, rising from streets that remember brownstone stoops and Art Deco ornamentation. Architecture in New York is a dialogue across centuries. Resilience in the face of tragedy. The events of September 11, 2001 reminded the city and the world that architecture is intertwined with human vulnerability. The destruction of the Twin Towers was a wound on the skyline and the soul of the city. Yet in response, architects, engineers, and citizens came together to rebuild. One World Trade Center, along with the memorial and museum, is a testament to resilience, a skyline rebuilt with purpose, memory, and hope. The city's ethos remains clear. Even after tragedy, New York rises again, stronger and wiser. Global influence.
Today, New York's skyline is internationally iconic. It is studied by architects worldwide, visited by millions, and recognized as a symbol of urban ambition, innovation, and resilience. The city's towers and public spaces serve as both functional structures and cultural symbols. They remind the world that architecture is not only about materials and engineering, but also about identity, storytelling, and aspiration. The skyline as living memory. Each era, from Dutch settlements to brownstones, Art Deco icons, steel giants, and glass towers, has left its imprint. The skyline is a chronicle in 3 dimensions, a narrative built of stone, steel, and vision. Tourists may marvel at One World Trade Center or the Empire State Building. Residents may cherish a quiet brownstone stoop. But anyone who studies the skyline closely will understand. It is not just a city of buildings, it is a city of people, dreams, and endurance. Every reflection on glass, every shadow of a spire, every historic brick carries memory. Every new tower writes the next chapter in an ongoing story, a story that began hundreds of years ago and will continue for centuries to come. Looking forward. The skyline of New York continues to evolve. Innovations in materials, design, and urban planning promise taller, smarter, and more sustainable buildings. Yet the lessons of history, resilience, preservation, and human scale remain vital. New York's skyline is a dialogue between past and future, ambition and responsibility, stone and steel, glass and humanity. It is a living testament to what a city can achieve when it dreams relentlessly, endures relentlessly, and rises relentlessly. And as the sun sets over the Hudson, the city glows, a constellation of achievement, memory, and hope. The echoes of stone and steel are everywhere, whispering, "This city never stops building, and it never stops dreaming."
Epilogue. The skyline as living memory. Standing on the banks of the Hudson River, or gazing across the East River from Brooklyn, one cannot help but be awed. The skyline of New York is more than an arrangement of towers and bridges and spires. It is a living memory, a layered narrative of ambition, resilience, and identity. From the modest wooden cottages of Dutch settlers to the soaring glass giants of the 21st century, every building carries a story. Every street tells a tale of labor, creativity, and human courage. Every reflection on steel or glass echoes centuries of dreams realized and dreams deferred, all converging into a city that never stops reaching skyward. A century of transformation. New York's skyline is unique because it is both organic and intentional. The early colonial streets were irregular and chaotic, growing from necessity rather than design. The 1811 Commissioner's Plan introduced order, a grid that allowed for rapid growth and systematic development. Brownstones reflected aspiration and domestic pride. Art Deco towers celebrated exuberance and cultural confidence. Steel giants demonstrated ingenuity and ambition. Glass skyscrapers revealed transparency, modernity, and global influence. Each era added layers of meaning, creating a skyline that is not static but evolving. Resilience and renewal. The city's towers also tell stories of resilience. They survived fires, economic depressions, wars, and tragedy. The rebuilding of the skyline after 9/11 stands as the ultimate symbol of New York's indomitable spirit. Yet resilience is more than engineering. It is about people, the builders, the planners, the workers, the dreamers. It is about a society that insists on growth, on reaching higher, on creating beauty amid chaos. The Skyline is a monument not just to architecture, but to human persistence. Cultural identity in steel and stone. New York skyline is inseparable from its cultural identity. It reflects immigration, commerce, art, technology, and social change. Brownstones tell of community. Art Deco towers tell of confidence. Glass skyscrapers tell of global ambition. Each building is a chapter in the city's autobiography, a way to read history in 3 dimensions. The skyline is not only what New York is, it is who New Yorkers are. Bridges across time. Bridges, from the Brooklyn Bridge to modern expressways and pedestrian crossings, remind us that the skyline is part of a broader urban narrative. The city grows upward, but it also grows outward, connecting communities and boroughs into a living organism. The skyline is both destination and passage, a reflection of continuity in a city defined by change. Architecture as storytelling. New York teaches us that architecture is storytelling in stone, steel, and glass. It chronicles centuries of human endeavor, struggle, triumph, and reinvention. The skyline is a conversation between eras. Colonial settlers laid the first stones. Brownstones gave dignity to domestic life. Art Deco spires celebrated optimism and craftsmanship. Steel giants demonstrated ingenuity and ambition. Glass skyscrapers revealed transparency, modernity, and global influence. All these elements coexist, overlapping, echoing, and conversing across time. The eternal dream. Looking at the skyline today, one realizes that the story is unfinished. The towers will continue to rise. New designs, new ambitions, new challenges will reshape the city yet again. The skyline is a mirror of human aspiration, a testament to the belief that even in the face of adversity, we build. Even in uncertainty, we dream. Even amidst chaos, we create order. New York skyline is the ultimate storyteller, not in words, but in form, shadow, light, and scale. A city that never stops. Every observer, visitor, and resident contributes to the story. Every person walking the streets, crossing a bridge, gazing at a tower, or climbing a brownstone stoop is part of the ongoing narrative. The city continues to grow, taller, smarter, and more connected, but it never forgets its origins. From the first settlers to the latest architects, from fires and floods to steel and glass, New York has always rebuilt, reimagined, and risen again. The skyline is its voice, echoing through time. We endure. We aspire. We rise. We are New York. Conclusion. The Living Chronicle. Echoes of Stone and Steel is more than a story of buildings. It is the story of a city and its people. It is a story of courage, imagination, and the relentless pursuit of possibility. The skyline is a living chronicle, forever evolving, forever inspiring. It reminds the world that a city is not merely a collection of structures, but a testament to the human spirit. And as night falls and the lights of Manhattan shimmer like constellations, one truth remains undeniable. New York will always rise.